The Edwardian era looked elegant. Silk gowns, lace gloves, delicate porcelain teacups. But behind closed doors, beneath the marble vanities and gilded mirrors, wealthy women were slowly poisoning themselves in the name of youth. They rubbed radium-laced cream into their cheeks to achieve a luminous glow. They applied mercury-based tonics to erase every freckle, unaware the cure was eating away at their muscles and minds. In Paris, surgeons were already lifting faces with experimental scalpels. The modern anti-aging industry, worth billions today, was born in this gilded age of toxic serums and surgical gamble. The price of staying young was higher than anyone imagined, and some women paid for it with their lives. This was the dawn of a new century. Queen Victoria was dead. The corsets were loosening, and for the first time, aging was treated not as a privilege, but as a problem. Department stores opened cosmetics counters. Newspapers ran daily beauty columns. Advertisements promised that a woman's worth could be measured in the smoothness of her skin, and women believed them. The tools of this new beauty culture were astonishingly advanced and terrifyingly toxic. Mercury-laced creams, guaranteed to erase every freckle, contained up to 15% pure metal. Radium, discovered just 3 years earlier, was already being mixed into face powders and tonics, sold as a luminous fountain of youth. Nobody yet understood that the glow was a slow irradiation, a poison that accumulated in bone and tissue with every application. In Paris, the first facelifts were being performed with crude scalpels and boil-sterilized instruments. The promise of tightened skin came with a very real risk of infection, nerve damage, or death. This collision of innovation and ignorance created the modern anti-aging industry, but it also left behind a trail of ruined bodies and quiet tragedies. Women who simply wanted to look young again became unwitting pioneers of a trillion-dollar market built on their desperation. The question that haunts this story is simple: what drove them to such extremes? And who profited from their sacrifice? The answers begin not in a laboratory, but in a perfumed boudoir, where a jar of cream glowed softly in the dark, and a woman reached for it one last time. The boudoir was silent, except for the soft hiss of the gas lamp. The woman seated before the gilded mirror was 32 years old, although the society columns still described her as 28. That small fiction was necessary because in this new Edwardian world, youth was currency, and any sign of age was a debt no husband would forgive. She dipped her fingers into a small porcelain jar and scooped out a pale, shimmering cream. The label promised it would restore a radiant, youthful glow, and the ingredients list, if anyone had bothered to read it, included nothing alarming. Just zinc oxide, glycerin, and a trace of something labeled simply as active radium salts. The cream was expensive, imported from Paris, and recommended by her dermatologist. She massaged it into her cheeks, her forehead, the delicate skin beneath her eyes. A faint warmth spread across her face, and she smiled. It felt like rejuvenation. It was, in fact, the slow burn of radiation settling into her bones. This was the Edwardian era, a decade sandwiched between the death of Queen Victoria in 1901 and the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. An age of motorcars and telephones, of suffragettes chaining themselves to railings, and of a middle class suddenly prosperous enough to imitate the aristocracy. But the most profound transformation was happening inside the home, at the dressing table, where women were being told for the first time that beauty was not a gift from God, but a product you could purchase, and that aging was not a natural process, but a failure of effort. Newspapers, which had recently exploded in circulation thanks to cheaper printing, carried daily beauty columns alongside the political news. The fashion pages of the Illustrated London News and Harper's Bazaar introduced readers to a parade of impossibly smooth-skinned actresses and socialites. Advertisements promised that a single jar of cream could erase a decade of worry lines, that a few drops of tonic could dissolve freckles overnight, that the right powder could make a 40-year-old face pass for 25. The message was relentless, and it was working. But this was not the earlier Victorian era, where heavy paint marked a woman as an actress or worse. The ideal Edwardian face was pure, natural, and untouched by artifice, which presented a conundrum. How do you alter your appearance while appearing not to have done so? The answer was a new class of products disguised as treatments. They were called skin foods, complexion tonics, freckle removers. They were sold not as makeup, but as medicine. And because they were marketed as health aids, they slipped past the almost non-existent regulations of the day. The most popular active ingredient in these treatments was mercury. Not trace amounts, not accidental contamination. Deliberate, concentrated mercury, often listed as chloride of mercury or ammoniated mercury. A typical freckle cream of 1905 contained up to 15% mercury by weight. It worked spectacularly. Mercury bleaches the skin by inhibiting melanin production, and within days, freckles and age spots faded to near invisibility. A flawless, porcelain complexion, the holy grail of Edwardian beauty, was suddenly attainable for a few shillings a jar. What the advertisements did not explain was that mercury is absorbed through the skin and accumulates in the kidneys, the liver, and the brain. Early symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning include fatigue, tremors, memory loss, and a peculiar form of psychosis marked by extreme shyness and irritability, once known as the Mad Hatter's disease. Women who used these creams daily, sometimes for years, began to notice they could not stop their hands from shaking. They mislaid their keys, forgot appointments, snapped at their children for no reason. Their skin peeled and grayed, their gums bled, and because the symptoms appeared so gradually, nobody connected the cause to the elegant little jar on the vanity. But here is the thing that makes this era so chilling. Mercury was not the most dangerous substance in the Edwardian beauty cabinet. That distinction belonged to a chemical so new, so miraculous, that its discoverers had won the Nobel Prize just a few years earlier. Radium. Marie and Pierre Curie isolated radium in 1898, and the world immediately fell in love. The element glowed with an eerie blue-green light, seemingly producing energy from nowhere. It was quickly understood that radium could destroy diseased tissue, making it a revolutionary tool against certain cancers. But this targeted destruction was misinterpreted as a general power of regeneration. If radium could kill cancer cells, the thinking went, surely it must also revitalize healthy ones. The leap from therapy to enhancement was tragically short. By the early 1900s, radium was being added to everything. Drinking water, bread, toothpaste, hair tonic, and, of course, face cream. The most prominent brand was Radio, a London company that launched a full line of radium-laced cosmetics in 1917, including night cream, rouge, and a face powder that promised to emit healthful rays. In France, a company called Thoradia produced a wildly popular range of radium-infused soaps and vanishing creams, complete with glowing packaging that evoked the Curie's laboratory. The marketing was explicit. Radium stimulated living cells, radium restored youthful energy, radium was the literal light of youth, captured in a jar. No independent testing was required. No safety warnings were printed on the label. The creams were applied directly to the face and left there for hours, sometimes overnight. The skin, warm and permeable, absorbed the radium salts, which then migrated through the bloodstream to the skeleton, where they continued to emit alpha particles for 1,600 years. Half-life does not care about good intentions. Meanwhile, another front was opening in the war on aging. On the continent, surgeons were beginning to explore the possibility that a woman's face could be mechanically rearranged. In 1901, a German surgeon named Eugen Hollander was approached by a Polish aristocrat who asked him to lift the skin around her mouth and eyes. Hollander, who had never performed such a procedure, made the incisions, repositioned the tissue, and sutured the skin back. The patient was satisfied, and the modern facelift was born. 6 years later, a medical book was published in Chicago, The Correction of Featural Imperfections by Charles Conrad Miller. It described techniques for nasal refinement, eyelid alteration, and the surgical tightening of facial skin. The procedures were crude by modern standards, performed without antibiotics, often under local anesthesia, with a real risk of infection, visible scarring, and permanent nerve damage. But for women who could afford it, the promise was immense, a literal physical reversal of time carved by a scalpel. In Paris, a female surgeon named Suzanne Noël was breaking barriers. She had trained in dermatology and reconstructive surgery, and in the 1910s, she began to specialize in cosmetic procedures for women. Her patients were actresses, socialites, and wives of wealthy industrialists. Noël was discreet, precise, and deeply empathetic to the social pressures her patients faced. She understood that a sagging jawline could cost a woman her career. She performed thousands of liftings over her career, pioneering techniques that would later become standard. But her work also marked a turning point. Beauty was now something that could be purchased not just in a jar, but on an operating table. The non-surgical tools were multiplying as well. Electric massage devices, powered by the new domestic electricity that was slowly wiring up the homes of the wealthy, promised to tone facial muscles and disperse fat. The violet ray high-frequency wand, invented by Nikola Tesla and adapted for cosmetic use, emitted a crackling purple glow that purported to stimulate circulation and tighten pores. Dental porcelain veneers allowed for the complete resurfacing of a smile. Even sleep itself was militarized. Special masks carved from animal bone were worn overnight to prevent wrinkling and to encourage the skin to adhere tightly to the skull. A woman might go to bed with her face painted in radium cream, strapped into a bone mask, her hair pinned beneath a silk cap, looking less like a sleeping beauty and more like a patient in some experimental clinic. This explosion of treatments did not happen in a vacuum. It was driven by two extraordinary rivals who were building empires on the insecurity of women. Their names were Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden. Rubinstein was a Polish-born Australian immigrant who started with a single pot of her mother's face cream and an unshakable belief that women would pay anything to preserve their youth. She opened her first salon in Melbourne in 1902, and by the outbreak of the Great War, she had taken London and Paris by storm. She taught women that beauty required a scientific system, cleansing, toning, and nourishing morning and night. She invented day cream and night cream as separate products, doubling her customers' spending in a stroke. Arden was a Canadian-born entrepreneur who opened her first Red Door salon on Fifth Avenue in New York in 1910. She understood that the experience of beauty was almost as important as the results. Her salons were temples of pink silk and soft lighting, where a woman could escape her daily life and be ministered to by white, uniformed attendants. Arden preached that every woman deserved to be beautiful, but she also knew that the real money was in making sure the treatments never stopped working. Between them, Rubinstein and Arden transformed the beauty industry from a secret shame into a legitimate aspirational culture. They sold not just creams, but a philosophy. The belief that a woman's face was a project, a canvas requiring constant investment. By the 1920s, they would be two of the wealthiest self-made women in the world. But they also created a market that was ravenous for novelty, and that hunger would be fed by chemists and manufacturers who operated with no oversight whatsoever. The consequences were already accumulating in quiet, private tragedies. It is difficult to know exactly how many women were sickened or killed by their beauty regimens in this era, because the deaths were rarely attributed to a jar of cream. A woman who died of kidney failure at 40 had likely caught a chill or suffered from weak constitution. The fact that she had been applying mercury to her face for a decade was never mentioned in the obituary. A dowager who succumbed to anemia and bone fractures was mourned as frail. The radium still glowing in her skeleton went undetected. But there were signs, if anyone had been looking. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in America, but it focused primarily on food adulteration, not cosmetics. A few medical journals began to publish case studies: the woman with the grayish gums and the uncontrollable tremor, the patient whose hair fell out in clumps after using a popular tonic. Doctors raised alarms, but they were drowned out by the advertising pages of the very newspapers that published their warnings. And then there were the workers, the young women employed in radium dial factories, painting watch faces with luminous paint, who were instructed to point their brushes with their lips. They would become known as the Radium Girls, and their horrific disfigurements and slow, public deaths in the 1920s would finally force a reckoning. But that reckoning was still a decade away. In the Edwardian boudoir, the jar glowed softly on the vanity, and the woman reached for it again. Because here is the deepest truth of this story. She was not foolish. She was not vain in the simple sense. She lived in a world that punished visible aging with astonishing cruelty. A woman who looked tired was assumed to be a bad wife. A woman with wrinkles was considered past her purpose. To refuse the new beauty treatments was not seen as prudence, but as negligence. The culture had made self-preservation into a duty, and the tools it provided were, in reality, instruments of slow suicide. The question is no longer just who profited, but who knew and who chose to look away. The answer begins with a single name, a woman whose face became the most famous advertisement for radium cream in the world. She appeared in every magazine, her skin luminous, her smile serene, and within 2 years she was dead. Her name was not recorded on the jar, but her story is where Act 1 ends and the real horror begins. Her name was Clara. She was 34 years old, and the wife of a prosperous shipping merchant in Southampton. In the autumn of 1909, a friend recommended a new skin tonic that had arrived from London, a cream that promised not merely to hide the tiny lines around her mouth, but to erase them entirely. The active ingredient, printed in delicate gold script on the label, was radium bromide, 0.5 micrograms per gram. The cream was the shade of pale moonlight and cost more per jar than her maid earned in a month. Clara applied it every night for 11 weeks. By the end of the 3rd month, her skin was undeniably smoother. The fine lines had softened. Friends complimented her complexion, asked what her secret was. She smiled and mentioned more sleep and a new diet. But she had also begun to notice something else. She was tired, more tired than she had ever been in her life. Her gums bled when she brushed her teeth. A persistent dull ache settled into her jaw. She dismissed it as neuralgia, then as anemia. Her doctor prescribed iron tonics and rest. Nobody asked about the jar on her vanity. The following spring, Clara developed a lesion on the inside of her left cheek that refused to heal. Her dentist, puzzled, pulled the adjacent tooth and packed the socket with gauze. When the wound continued to grow, he referred her to a surgeon in London. The surgeon made an incision and discovered that a section of her jawbone had become so brittle it crumbled under the knife. The tissue surrounding it was gray and dead. He removed a segment of her mandible, sewed her face closed, and wrote in his notes, "Necrosis of the bone, cause unknown." Clara died 3 months later, her body riddled with secondary infections. 30 years later, when the dangers of radium were finally understood, a pathologist reviewing old records would estimate that Clara had absorbed the equivalent of several thousand chest X-rays directly into the tissues of her face. The radium she had so faithfully massaged into her skin had migrated into her bones, where it continued to irradiate her from the inside until the day she died. She was one of the first known casualties of cosmetic radium. She would not be the last. The tragedy of Clara and women like her was not that they used dangerous products. It was that the entire culture had conspired to tell them those products were safe, even virtuous. By the early 1900s, a vast infrastructure of advertising, medical endorsement, and social pressure had been constructed around the idea that a woman's appearance was her single most valuable asset. Every magazine, every newspaper, every department store window reinforced the same message: your face is your fortune, and you must defend it at any cost. The chemists who manufactured these creams did not consider themselves charlatans. Many were trained scientists who genuinely believed in the restorative power of the substances they employed. Mercury, after all, had been used for centuries to treat syphilis and skin conditions. Radium had been shown to shrink tumors. If these powerful agents could destroy unhealthy tissue, surely they could also fortify healthy tissue? The logic was faulty, but it was sincerely held. And because the regulatory apparatus that we take for granted today did not yet exist, there was no one to test these assumptions before the products went to market. The United States had passed the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, a landmark piece of legislation that required certain labeling standards for food and pharmaceuticals. But the act explicitly did not cover cosmetics. A face cream, no matter how toxic, was legally classified as a luxury item, not a drug. This loophole was not an oversight. It was a deliberate concession to the powerful toiletry manufacturers who lobbied against any regulation that might interfere with their profits. The result was that a manufacturer could put almost anything into a jar, call it a complexion aid, and sell it without ever demonstrating that it was safe. European regulations were even more lax. In France, the perfume and cosmetics industry was a pillar of the national economy, and the government had no desire to interfere with its success. In Britain, the medical establishment had issued occasional warnings about mercury-laced skin bleaches since the 1860s, but these warnings were aimed primarily at the lower-class women who bought cheap, adulterated products from street vendors. The assumption, deeply classist and deeply wrong, was that expensive creams sold by reputable chemists were inherently safe. A wealthy woman could poison herself with the finest mercury white in London, and no coroner would think to list vanity as a contributing cause of death. But here is the thing: not everyone was silent. Within the medical community, a small number of doctors were beginning to sound the alarm. In 1903, a physician named William Henry Battle published a series of case studies in the British Medical Journal documenting severe symptoms in women who had used mercury-based skin lighteners. He described cases of chronic tremor, memory loss, and a distinctive gray-blue discoloration of the gums known as a mercury line. In 1907, a dermatologist in New York named James Corning presented a paper on the neurological effects of cosmetic mercury poisoning, noting that several of his patients had been institutionalized for symptoms indistinguishable from senile dementia. They were in their 30s. These warnings were published in respectable medical journals. They were discussed at professional conferences. They were, in theory, available to anyone who cared to read them. But they were also contained within an information ecosystem that was almost entirely separate from the world of the popular press. The magazines and newspapers that carried the beauty advertisements were the same ones that women read for pleasure and instruction. Those publications were not about to run articles that directly contradicted their own advertisers. The few medical warnings that did filter into the mainstream were dismissed as the ravings of alarmists or, worse, as an attack on female vanity itself. A woman who read about the dangers of mercury cream and continued to use it was not a victim. She was a fool. This framing made it very easy to ignore the warnings. Meanwhile, the machinery of desire was accelerating. The department store had become the cathedral of the new consumer age. Harrods in London, Macy's in New York, the Galeries Lafayette in Paris. These were not merely places to buy goods, but immersive environments designed to overwhelm the senses and erode restraint. The cosmetics counter was strategically placed near the main entrance, where the light was brightest and the foot traffic heaviest. Saleswomen in crisp white uniforms, trained to project an air of medical authority, offered free samples and whispered consultations. A woman who entered a department store to buy gloves might leave with a jar of cream she had never heard of an hour earlier. And then there were the salon queens, Helena, Rubinstein, and Elizabeth Arden. Rivals so fierce they refused to speak each other's name aloud, were building empires not on individual products but on entire systems of belief. Rubinstein's philosophy was rooted in what she called the science of beauty. She had trained, or claimed to have trained, with dermatologists in Vienna, and had brought a vaguely continental air of expertise to her salons. She wore a white lab coat when she examined her clients' faces, and she delivered her diagnoses with the gravity of a physician. She classified skin into types: oily, dry, combination, sensitive, and insisted that each type required a different ritual of care. These categories, which are now so familiar as to seem natural, were entirely her invention. She created the problem and sold the solution, and women were so grateful they paid her whatever she asked. Arden, for her part, understood that beauty was an emotional experience before it was a physical one. Her Red Door salons were temples of pink. Pink walls, pink furniture, pink uniforms, pink packaging. The color was an assault on the senses so complete that stepping into an Arden salon felt like entering a separate dimension where the anxieties of the outside world could not follow. Her attendants were trained in what she called the Arden touch, a method of applying creams and massage that was firm enough to feel therapeutic but gentle enough to feel pampering. Arden did not just sell youth. She sold the feeling of being cared for, and that feeling was so seductive that her clients returned week after week, year after year, handing over steadily larger sums of money. Between them, Rubinstein and Arden educated an entire generation of women to believe that the care of the skin was not a luxury but a moral obligation. A woman who neglected her complexion was a woman who had let herself go, who had surrendered her self-respect, who had failed in the fundamental duty of being presentable. The language of beauty became indistinguishable from the language of virtue. This moral urgency was the engine that powered the entire anti-aging industry, and it is still running today. But even as the salons multiplied and the profits soared, the toxic heart of the industry continued to beat. The problem was not just that some creams contained poison. The deeper problem was that the entire model of commercial beauty depended on the premise that the skin was a barrier that needed to be constantly breached. The creams had to do something. If they merely sat on the surface, they were no different from cold cream or lard, and no one would pay a premium for them. So chemists were under constant pressure to formulate products that penetrated, that changed the skin's structure, that produced visible results fast enough to justify the next purchase. And the most effective penetration enhancers, the ones that worked the fastest and showed the most dramatic results, were often the ones that were also the most dangerous. By the early 1910s, a shadow industry had developed around this imperative. Mail-order companies sold freckle removers through discreetly wrapped parcels, promising that a few weeks of treatment would leave the skin as white and smooth as alabaster. The active ingredient was almost always ammoniated mercury, sometimes coupled with carbolic acid to strip the outer layers of skin. The treatment worked by chemically burning the epidermis, which then peeled away to reveal a fresh layer beneath. The effect was indeed a temporary clarity, but the skin that regrew was thinner, more sensitive, and more vulnerable to repeated treatments. Women became trapped in a cycle of damage and repair, their skin addicted to the very products that were destroying it. One such product, sold under the name Madame Dupree's Miracle Bleach, was analyzed by a chemist in 1912 and found to contain 18% mercury by weight. It was sold without warning labels, without instructions for safe use, and without any mention of the active ingredient. A jar of Madame Dupree's Miracle Bleach cost 2 shillings and was available through a classified advertisement in the back pages of a popular women's weekly. That advertisement ran uninterrupted for 8 years. During that time, the company received thousands of letters from satisfied customers. It also received at least a dozen letters from the families of women who had died, complaining that the product had poisoned their wives, mothers, and daughters. Those letters were filed and ignored, and then the radium companies entered the market in earnest. Radior, Founded in London in 1917 by a former pharmacist named Albert Smith, was the most brazen. Smith had no medical training, but he had a genius for marketing. He understood that the word radium carried a halo of scientific wonder. He designed his packaging with glowing green labels and sold his products through advertisements that featured a beautiful woman whose face seemed to emit a soft, otherworldly light. The copy read, "Radior Radium Beauty Cream, the living light that rejuvenates every cell." The company sold face cream, rouge, vanishing cream, soap, and a radium pad, a small cushion impregnated with radium salts that was to be strapped to the face overnight to drive the active ingredients deep into the skin. The radium pad was Smith's most profitable product and his most lethal. The pad was designed to rest directly against the cheeks, the nose, and the mouth. When a woman placed it on her face and went to sleep, the gentle warmth of her skin accelerated the release of radium particles directly into her mucous membranes. Some pads, when tested decades later, were found to emit enough radiation that using one for a month would have delivered a dose comparable to receiving a dental X-ray every single night. The damage was cumulative, silent, and, at the time, utterly invisible. Radia was not a fringe operation. It was sold through Harrods, Selfridges, and several prestigious London pharmacies. It was advertised in Vogue, the Illustrated London News, and the Tatler. It was recommended by a handful of doctors who received a commission on every sale. By 1920, Radior products were being shipped to customers in every corner of the British Empire. The company's slogan, unchanged from the day it launched, was Radior, the giver of youth and beauty. No one at the company ever questioned whether the gift of youth might come with a hidden cost. Or if they did, the question was never recorded in the minutes of any board meeting. The truth is that the dangers of radium were not entirely unknown, even in 1917. As early as 1900, the German scientist Friedrich Giesel had described the corrosive effects of radium salts on skin tissue. In 1902, Pierre Curie himself had deliberately exposed a patch of his own arm to a radium source to test the effects. The wound took months to heal, and the scar remained visible for years. The Curies were well aware that radium was a double-edged sword, and they repeatedly warned against its casual use. But they had no control over the commercial exploitation of their discovery, and their warnings were drowned out by the roar of the marketplace. The man who did more than anyone to expose the dangers of radium was not a scientist, but a pathologist named Harrison Martland. In the early 1920s, Martland was working in New Jersey, where a cluster of strange deaths among young women began to draw his attention. The women had all worked in the same factory, the United States Radium Corporation, painting luminous numbers on watch dials. They had been told the paint was harmless. They had been instructed to shape the tips of their brushes with their lips. They had swallowed tiny amounts of radium every day for years, and now they were dying, their jaws rotting away, their bones riddled with holes. The story of the Radium Girls is well known today, and it deserves every word that has been written about it. But what is less often remembered is that the Radium Girls were not the only victims. They were simply the most visible, the most concentrated, the easiest to investigate because they all worked in one place. Across the country and across the ocean, thousands of other women were absorbing radium from their face creams, their hair tonics, their over-the-counter medical treatments, their drinking water. The doses were lower, spread out over years, and the symptoms were often dismissed as the ordinary aches and pains of aging. A fractured femur at 60 was an unfortunate fall, not a radiation injury. A jaw that crumbled during a dental extraction was a mystery, not a scandal. The dispersed, quiet deaths of the cosmetics users never coalesced into a single, explosive narrative. They simply faded, one by one, into the silence of unexamined medical records. But Harrison Martland's work on the Radium Girls had established a crucial scientific link. He had proved, through exhaustive autopsies and chemical analysis, that radium, once ingested or absorbed, migrated to the bones and remained there. He had demonstrated that alpha particles, the type of radiation emitted by radium, were especially destructive to bone marrow. He had shown, beyond any reasonable doubt, that prolonged exposure led to anemia, bone necrosis, and a horrifying array of cancers. His research was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1925. It was the most important medical paper on radium toxicity ever written, and it should have ended the use of radium in consumer products overnight. It did not. The radium industry fought back. Lawyers for the United States Radium Corporation denied that the substance was harmful, attacked Martland's methods, and used every procedural tactic available to delay and obstruct. It took years of litigation before the Radium Girls received any compensation at all. Meanwhile, the manufacturers of radium-laced cosmetics watched the legal battles with interest. If the watch painting company could delay justice for so long, what chance did anyone have of proving that a jar of face cream had caused a woman's death years after she had used it? The burden of proof was impossibly high, and the statute of limitations was impossibly short. The beauty industry realized, correctly, that it was all but immune to legal challenge. So it did what any unregulated industry does when it discovers it can operate without consequences. It expanded. By the late 1920s, the range of radium-infused beauty products had grown to include lipsticks, eyeshadows, hair dyes, shampoos, body powders, and even sanitary napkins infused with radioactive beneficial rays. A French company, Edwardian, launched a full cosmetics line in 1932 with the explicit blessing, or so the advertising implied, of the Curie family. In reality, the company had licensed the name from a distant relative with no scientific credentials, and the actual formula contained only the barest trace of radium. But the marketing was devastatingly effective. The Edwardian advertisements featured a woman whose skin gleamed like polished marble, and the brand became synonymous with scientific sophistication. A generation of women who had grown up believing in the power of science now believed that putting radiation on their faces was the height of modern self-care. The mercury story followed a parallel track. By the 1920s, a few American states had attempted to regulate mercury in cosmetics, but the laws were weak and poorly enforced. The federal government remained paralyzed by a combination of industry lobbying and a political philosophy that held that regulation was an infringement on personal liberty. A woman who chose to put mercury on her face was exercising her freedom of choice. If the product harmed her, that was a matter between her and the manufacturer, not a matter for the government. This logic, which we now recognize as a recipe for corporate abuse, was the unchallenged orthodoxy of the era. But public sentiment was beginning to shift, and the shift had a name. Her name was Ruth DeForest Lamb. Lamb was the Chief Education Officer of the Food and Drug Administration, and she was, by all accounts, a woman of formidable intelligence and unshakable purpose. In 1936, she published a book titled American Chamber of Horrors, a methodically researched, vividly written exposé of the unregulated drug and cosmetics market. The book detailed case after case of women who had been blinded, scarred, poisoned, and killed by products that were sold with no safety testing and no warning labels. Lamb described a woman whose face had been permanently disfigured by a mercury-laden freckle cream. She described a young bride who had died of lead poisoning after using a hair dye that contained lead acetate. She described an actress whose career had been destroyed when a popular skin peel dissolved the collagen in her cheeks. American Chamber of Horrors was not a dry government report. It was a polemic, and it was written to shock. Lamb invited women to tour a literal exhibition of dangerous products that she had assembled in Washington, a hall of horrors featuring the jars and bottles that had ruined lives. The exhibition drew large crowds and extensive press coverage. For the first time, the scale of the problem was made visible. Women began to demand action. The cosmetics industry, sensing a threat to its profits, mobilized to defeat the growing calls for regulation. The trade association representing toiletry manufacturers argued that their products were safe, that the reported injuries were rare and usually the result of misuse, and that government oversight would stifle innovation and cost jobs. Their lobbyists worked the halls of Congress with the same arguments that tobacco and chemical companies would use in later decades. They spread doubt, they funded sympathetic legislators, and they stalled. But the tide had turned. The deaths of the radium girls, the mounting evidence of mercury poisoning, and the relentless advocacy of Ruth DeForest Lamb had created a political environment in which regulation was finally possible. In 1938, Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which, for the first time, gave the FDA the authority to regulate cosmetics. The act outlawed the sale of adulterated or misbranded cosmetic products, required that certain ingredients be disclosed, and empowered the FDA to seize dangerous products and prosecute their manufacturers. The passage of the act was a watershed. Mercury concentrations in skin creams were reduced, slowly and grudgingly, to below 5%, and eventually to trace levels. Radium was quietly withdrawn from cosmetics, its dangers too well publicized to sustain the market any longer. The era of the openly toxic beauty product was drawing to a close. But here is what nobody talks about. The act did not require cosmetics manufacturers to prove that their products were safe before selling them. It did not establish a pre-market approval process. It did not ban entire categories of ingredients. It simply allowed the FDA to act after a product was found to be dangerous. This meant that the burden of proof remained on the regulators, not the manufacturers. A company could still release a new face cream with an untested ingredient, and the FDA would have to investigate, build a case, and prove harm, a process that could take years, during which the product remained on the shelves. The Act of 1938 was a victory, but it was not a solution. It closed one door and left a dozen windows wide open. The beauty industry adapted, as it always did, by finding new ingredients that were not yet regulated and new claims that fell just short of the legal definition of a drug. The toxic chemistry of the Edwardian era faded from memory, but the underlying business model survived and thrived. Women were still being told that their worth depended on the condition of their skin, that aging was an enemy to be fought with every available weapon, and that the highest expression of self-care was to purchase the latest product, however unproven, however expensive, however potentially dangerous. The jar of radium cream had been taken off the market, but the hunger it fed was sharper than ever, and as the 1930s gave way to the 40s, a new generation of beauty entrepreneurs was already at work, dialing the same old promises into the gleaming new language of mid-century science. The story was far from over. In some ways, it was only just beginning. The passage of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938 was supposed to be the end. The toxic jars were confiscated. The radium advertisements vanished from the pages of Vogue. Ruth DeForest Lamb was hailed as a hero, and the beauty industry issued solemn statements promising a new era of safety and responsibility. The war on dangerous cosmetics, it seemed, had been won. But wars are rarely won in a single battle. The industry that had grown rich on mercury and radium did not suddenly discover a conscience. It simply changed tactics. The same chemists who had once mixed arsenic into complexion wafers now turned their attention to the new frontier: hormones. The same marketers who had sold radium as liquid light now polished a fresh vocabulary, words like biologically active, cellular renewal, deep acting. The packaging changed. The promises did not. Even as the ink was drying on the new law, a fresh generation of anti-aging products was already rolling off production lines. This time, the active ingredient was not a heavy metal, but something far more intimate: estrogen. Scientists had recently isolated the female sex hormone, and its effects on skin, hair, and body fat were being studied with intense interest. Estrogen was understood to play a role in maintaining youthful skin texture, and the logic that followed was as seductive as it was simplistic. If declining estrogen caused aging, then replacing estrogen must reverse it. By the early 1940s, estrogen creams were being marketed to women as a way to restore the bloom of youth. No clinical trials had been conducted. No long-term safety data existed. The hormone was absorbed through the skin, entered the bloodstream, and circulated through the entire body. Women who used these creams were conducting an uncontrolled experiment on themselves, with no one monitoring the results. But the really big pivot, the one that would define the next half-century, was happening elsewhere. Cosmetic surgery, which had been a fringe practice in the Edwardian era, was moving into the mainstream. Surgeons who had honed their skills on the ravaged faces of World War veterans were now applying those techniques to the wrinkles and jowls of wealthy civilians. The stigma that had once attached to facelifts began to erode, replaced by a new openness, a willingness to speak about having a little work done. The change was accelerated by the rise of Hollywood, where the camera's unforgiving eye made even minor signs of aging a liability. Actresses quietly underwent procedures and emerged looking refreshed, attributing their new tightness to a good night's sleep or a change in diet. The public learned to read between the lines. By the 1950s, the facelift had become a status symbol among a certain class of women. But the techniques were still primitive by today's standards. Surgeons pulled the skin tight, removed the excess, and stitched it back, often creating an unnaturally taut, wind-blown look that fooled no one. The deeper layers of muscle and connective tissue were left untouched. The results did not last, and repeated surgeries led to the stretched, mask-like faces that would later become a cautionary cliché. Still, the demand grew, because the alternative, visible aging, was increasingly framed as a personal failure. But here is where the story takes a turn that even the most cynical observer might not have predicted. The beauty industry did not simply continue to sell creams and surgeries. It began to colonize the very definition of health. The line between medicine and cosmetics blurred, and with it, the line between doctor and salesperson. Dermatologists, once the sober guardians of skin health, began to form lucrative partnerships with cosmetics companies. They endorsed products, lent their names to advertising, and developed doctor-only lines that were sold through their offices at a premium. The white coat became a marketing tool. Women who visited their dermatologist for a suspicious mole might leave with a bag of expensive serums, convinced that these products were medically necessary. This convergence reached its apotheosis in the development of what would become the most successful anti-aging drug of all time. In the 1980s, researchers studying vitamin A derivatives discovered that a compound called tretinoin, marketed as Retin-A, not only cleared acne, but could measurably reduce the appearance of fine wrinkles. For the first time, a prescription drug had been proven to reverse signs of photoaging. The FDA approved it not as a cosmetic, but as a medication, and the floodgates opened. Dermatologists wrote millions of prescriptions. The message was clear. Fighting aging was no longer a luxury, it was a medical treatment. Your doctor could now legally prescribe youth in a tube. The psychological consequences of this shift were profound and have never been fully reckoned with. Aging, a universal and inevitable biological process, was reclassified as a pathology. The language of disease crept into the beauty counter. Products promised to fight, combat, attack, and defend against the signs of aging. Every sag, every line, every age spot became an enemy to be defeated by an arsenal of increasingly expensive weapons. And the weapons multiplied because the market demanded them. Behind every jar of retinol cream lay 100 years of conditioning, a century of being told that the worst thing a woman could be was old. But wait, it gets bigger. It gets worse in ways that the Edwardian women with their radium pads could never have imagined. Because the modern anti-aging industry did not just expand the product catalog, it globalized the insecurity. By the late 20th century, the beauty standard that had been forged in London and Paris was being exported to every corner of the globe. In countries where aging had once been respected, even revered, the new gospel of youth arrived via satellite television and the internet, and it was embraced with the fervor of a new religion. Skin-lightening creams, the direct descendants of those mercury-laden Edwardian bleaches, became a multi-billion-dollar market in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Many of these creams still contained mercury, despite decades of regulation. Because the demand was so intense and the enforcement so weak, women were still poisoning themselves for paler skin, and the industry was still looking the other way. At the same time, the surgical frontier advanced into territory that made the early facelifts look quaint. Injectable fillers, derived from bovine collagen and later from hyaluronic acid, allowed wrinkles to be erased in a lunch break. Botox, a purified form of the most lethal toxin known to science, was injected into millions of faces to paralyze the muscles that cause frown lines. The treatment worked beautifully, and it normalized the idea of injecting a neurotoxin into one's face for cosmetic purposes. The procedure was safe when performed correctly, but the underlying logic was the same logic that had guided Clara's nightly application of radium cream. It is acceptable to alter your body's biological processes in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal, and the risks are worth the reward. Then came the era of the mommy makeover, the Brazilian butt lift, the full-body contouring procedures that have become so popular in recent years. These surgeries carry real risks, including death from fat embolism, but they are marketed as acts of self-empowerment. The language has evolved from the Edwardian moral duty to preserve one's looks to the modern language of self-care and doing it for yourself. But the underlying transaction is unchanged. A woman's body is a project requiring constant investment, and the failure to invest is a sign of laziness, not prudence. And so we arrive at the final, and perhaps most disturbing, twist in this long narrative. The Edwardian beauty industry was, by any reasonable measure, a criminal enterprise. It sold poison as luxury and killed its customers with impunity. But it was, at least, obviously dangerous, and it was eventually, partially, reined in. The modern anti-aging industry is larger, more sophisticated, and far more insidious. Most of its products are not acutely toxic. Most of its procedures are not lethal. But the cumulative psychological toll, the relentless drumbeat of inadequacy, the billions of dollars extracted from women who have been taught to fear the natural passage of time, this is a different kind of harm, and it is one for which there is no FDA, no Ruth DeForest Lamb, no single law that can fix it. The real legacy of the Edwardian women with their glowing jars of radium is not the products they used. It is the machine they helped to build, a machine that took their genuine desire for dignity and twisted it into a source of endless profit. A machine that learned over a century to refine its methods, to clothe its demands in the language of science and liberation, and to become so woven into the fabric of daily life that most of us no longer even see it. The jar of radium cream is gone. The machine is still running, and it has never been stronger. And yet, within the very machine that now spans the globe, there are signs of a reckoning. The same forces that enabled a century of exploitation, the internet, the democratization of information, the growing willingness of women to speak openly about their experiences, are now being turned against the industry. The question is whether this reckoning will be enough, or whether the machine will simply adapt again, as it always has, and find a new way to sell the same old fear. The answer lies buried not in a laboratory, but in a graveyard, alongside the women who were the first to pay the ultimate price for the promise of eternal youth. Their bones, still faintly radioactive more than a century later, have one final story to tell. The graveyard is a quiet one, tucked behind a stone church in a village that no longer appears on most maps. The headstones here are weathered, some leaning at angles that suggest the earth beneath them has shifted slowly over a century. Among them is a modest granite marker, the name barely legible, the dates corresponding to a woman who died in her late 30s in the spring of 1910. The cause of death is not inscribed. It rarely is. For decades, this grave held its secrets undisturbed. Then, in the early 2000s, a team of forensic anthropologists from a nearby university received permission to exhume several remains from this churchyard as part of a study on historical radiation exposure. They were looking for evidence of environmental contamination, perhaps from a forgotten industrial site. What they found instead was the skeleton of a woman whose bones told a story that had been buried with her for nearly 100 years. When the researchers placed a Geiger counter near the remains, the needle jumped. The readings were not off the scale, but they were unmistakably elevated, concentrated in the skull, the jaw, and the long bones of the arms. Alpha particle tracks, the microscopic scars left by radium decay, were embedded throughout the bone matrix. This woman had not worked in a watch factory. She had not painted luminous dials. She was, according to the scant historical records that accompanied the grave, the wife of a prosperous merchant. She had lived a life of comfort and privilege, and she had died, the forensic analysis now strongly suggested, from the cumulative effects of the radium-laced face cream she had applied every night for years. The researchers published their findings in a medical journal, noting that this was one of the earliest documented cases of cosmetic radiation poisoning. The article attracted brief attention, a few news stories, a mention in a documentary about the Radium Girls. Then it faded from public consciousness, as so many historical warnings do. But the skeleton remains in a laboratory storage facility, a silent witness to what happens when beauty culture outruns caution. This woman was not an anomaly. She was part of a pattern, a wave of quiet deaths that stretched from the Edwardian era well into the 1930s, until regulation finally caught up with the worst of the market. But the regulation, as we have seen, was never complete. It was a dam built across a river, and the river found ways around it. The most obvious bypass, and the most persistent, has been the global skin lightening industry. The mercury creams that Edwardian women used to erase their freckles never truly disappeared. They migrated. By the mid-20th century, the largest markets for these products were no longer in London or Paris, but in Lagos, Mumbai, Manila, and Kingston. The same chemical compounds, ammoniated mercury and mercurous chloride, were being manufactured in unregulated factories and sold in unlabeled containers, often for pennies a gram. The promise was identical: lighter skin, a more refined appearance, greater social and economic opportunity. The consequences were identical as well. In 1996, the World Health Organization declared that mercury-containing skin creams posed a serious global health risk. Studies in West Africa found that up to 40% of women in some urban areas regularly used such products. Blood and urine tests revealed mercury levels in users that were many times higher than safe limits. Cases of mercury poisoning, including neurological damage, kidney failure, and birth defects, were documented in dermatology clinics from Senegal to Saudi Arabia. Yet the trade continued, driven by an underground network of manufacturers who exploited weak enforcement and desperate consumers. Even in countries with robust regulatory systems, the beauty industry has demonstrated a remarkable ability to stay one step ahead of the law. When mercury was restricted, it shifted to hydroquinone, a potent skin bleaching agent that is now banned in several countries but remains widely available online. When hydroquinone came under scrutiny, the industry pivoted to a rotating cast of newer, less studied compounds, each marketed as a breakthrough, each carrying the implicit promise that it could make a woman look younger, lighter, or more luminous than nature intended. The pattern is always the same. The substance is introduced with breathless enthusiasm and slick advertising. It is sold before it is understood. It achieves enormous popularity because it fills a need that the culture has systematically manufactured. By the time the harms become undeniable, the manufacturer has either moved on to the next product or has insulated itself behind a wall of legal protections that make accountability all but impossible. And the women who have been harmed are left holding a jar of cream and a body that will never fully recover. This cycle of innovation, harm, and evasion is not a bug in the anti-aging industry. It is the operating system. The Edwardian era gave us the template: identify a fear, sell a cure, externalize the costs, and disclaim responsibility. Every generation since has merely updated the ingredients and the language. The radium girls, the factory workers who painted watch dials with luminous paint, are remembered today as heroes. Their legal battle against the United States Radium Corporation in the 1920s established the right of workers to sue employers for occupational diseases, a foundational precedent in labor law. Their story has been told in books, films, and museum exhibits, but the women who bought radium cream over the counter, who absorbed the same poison through their skin rather than their lips, are rarely mentioned in these histories. They were not workers, they were consumers. And the legal system has always been more reluctant to hold manufacturers accountable for harm done to consumers than for harm done to employees. The reason for this disparity is complicated, but it boils down to a simple dynamic. A worker is visibly connected to a specific employer and a specific workplace. The chain of causation, while difficult to prove in the case of a disease that takes years to manifest, is at least conceptually clear. A consumer, by contrast, interacts with a product in the privacy of her own home, often using multiple products from multiple manufacturers over many years. If she becomes ill, it is nearly impossible to prove which jar of cream, which bottle of tonic, was the culprit. The beauty industry has exploited this evidentiary fog for more than a century. And yet, there have been moments when the fog has lifted. Ruth DeForest Lamb's American Chamber of Horrors was one such moment. The publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which exposed the dangers of unregulated pesticides, also sparked a broader public skepticism toward chemical products, including cosmetics. In the 1970s, the environmental movement forced a new round of regulation, banning certain known carcinogens from consumer products and requiring more rigorous testing. Each of these moments was met with fierce resistance from industry, and each resulted in incremental improvement rather than sweeping reform. But the cumulative effect was real. The products on the shelves today are safer in a narrow toxicological sense than the products of a century ago. They are less likely to kill you outright. Less likely, but not entirely safe. The question of long-term, low-dose exposure to the thousands of synthetic chemicals that are now permitted in cosmetics remains largely unanswered. The European Union has adopted a precautionary approach, banning or restricting more than 1,300 chemicals from cosmetic use. The United States, by contrast, has banned or restricted fewer than a dozen. The regulatory gap is vast, and it is filled by a sprawling network of self-regulation, voluntary standards, and industry-funded safety assessments that lack the independence and rigor that public health requires. And even if every product were chemically inert, even if not a single molecule of harm entered a single woman's bloodstream, the industry would still exact a toll. The toll is measured not in parts per million, but in the hours spent in front of mirrors, the money diverted from other needs, the mental energy consumed by the endless project of self-surveillance. It is measured in the 12-year-old girls who now ask for anti-aging serums, having absorbed the message that prevention must start before a single line appears. It is measured in the 70-year-old women who feel invisible, who have internalized the lesson that their faces, in their natural state, are unacceptable for public view. This psychological toll is not a side effect of the beauty industry. It is the product. A woman who feels confident in her own aging skin is a lost customer. The entire edifice depends on the maintenance of a low-grade, permanent anxiety, a sense that one is never quite doing enough, that the next product might be the one that finally delivers the promised transformation. The industry does not want to cure the fear of aging. It wants to manage it, to keep it simmering just below the surface, never boiling over into despair, but never cooling into acceptance. The final, surprising detail that brings this story full circle is this. In 2018, a team of physicists at a university in the United Kingdom published a paper in a journal devoted to radiation protection. They had been studying archival samples of vintage cosmetics, including several jars of Radior cream recovered from estate sales and museum collections. Using modern spectrometry, they measured the precise radium content of these products and calculated the radiation dose that a regular user would have absorbed over the course of a year. The results were startling. The dose to the skin of the face, they estimated, was comparable to receiving a full CT scan every night. The dose to the underlying bone, accumulated over years of use, would have been sufficient to cause the exact pattern of necrosis and cancer that the forensic anthropologists had observed in the skeletons they exhumed. But the researchers did something else. They took one of the jars, still sealed, and placed it in a display case at the university's Medical History Museum. The jar sits there now, its label still faintly legible, the cream inside long since dried to a pale, cracked residue, and the Geiger counter that the curators have placed beside it continues to tick, softly, patiently, more than a century after the jar was filled. The radiation has not gone away. It will not go away for another 1,500 years. The promise of eternal youth, it turns out, was a promise of eternal decay. That jar, glowing faintly in its museum case, is the perfect symbol of the entire anti-aging enterprise. It was sold by people who did not fully understand what they were selling. It was bought by women who did not understand what they were buying. It promised to stop time and instead accelerated the very processes it claimed to reverse. It was, in every respect, a lie wrapped in a beautiful package. And yet, if you were to ask a modern consumer whether she would buy a product that promised to make her look younger, that was backed by scientific language, that came in elegant packaging and was sold by a reputable retailer, the answer for most would still be yes. The jar has changed. The hunger has not. The machine that was built in the Edwardian era is one of the greatest commercial achievements in human history. It has survived world wars, economic depressions, regulatory crackdowns, and a century of scientific advancement that has repeatedly exposed its foundational myths. It has adapted to every challenge, incorporating the language of its critics into its own marketing. It has learned to sell natural beauty as expertly as it once sold scientific beauty. It has embraced body positivity and inclusivity, while still quietly implying that the most inclusive thing of all is to look younger. It has become so deeply embedded in the culture that it is difficult to imagine a world without it. But imagining that world is precisely what the women who suffered and died in the early years of this industry might ask us to do. Clara, whose jaw crumbled under a surgeon's knife. The anonymous woman in the churchyard, whose skeleton still registers on Geiger counters. The thousands of others whose names are lost, whose deaths were attributed to natural causes. They did not set out to become martyrs. They simply wanted to keep their place in a society that was telling them, with increasing urgency, that their faces were their fortunes. They used the tools they were given, and those tools killed them. Their legacy is not the creams or the surgeries. It is the question that their stories pose to every woman who stands in front of a mirror, to every consumer who reads an advertisement, to every society that tells its members that their worth is measured in the smoothness of their skin. The question is not whether we will age. We will. The question is whether we will continue to pay with our health, our money, and our peace of mind for the privilege of pretending otherwise. The ticking jar in the museum case is not a warning about radium. Radium is no longer in our cosmetics. It is a warning about the structure of desire, about the way that fear can be manufactured and sold back to us, about the incredible durability of a business model that profits from insecurity. The names of the poisons change. The machine remains the same. The machine is not a conspiracy. It is something far more powerful. A self-perpetuating cycle of desire, profit, and harm that no single law or revelation has ever been able to stop. It feeds on fear, a fear that was carefully planted in the Edwardian boudoir and has been cultivated through every decade since. And because the fear is never fully satisfied, because every new product fails to deliver the permanent transformation it promises, the machine never runs out of fuel. The women who died from radium creams and mercury bleaches are not distant historical curiosities. They are the canaries in the coal mine of a much larger system. They showed us, with their bodies, what happens when an industry is allowed to prioritize profit over safety, when cultural pressure is so intense that women will risk their health to conform, and when the regulatory structures meant to protect the public are captured by the interests they are supposed to oversee. We have not escaped that system. We have simply refined it. But history is not destiny. The same forces that built the anti-aging machine also generated the antibodies, the journalists who exposed the scams, the scientists who refused to be silenced, the legislators who finally acted, and the ordinary women who began to question whether they wanted to spend their lives and their money fighting a war they could never win. The story of Edwardian beauty culture is, in one sense, a story of exploitation and tragedy. In another, it is a story of resistance, slow and incomplete, but real. You have just spent some time in a world where the brightest promise concealed the darkest poison. You have heard the names of a few of the women who suffered, and you have traced the long arc from a jar of glowing cream to a trillion-dollar global industry. Perhaps the most important thing to take from this is not anger at the past, but clarity about the present. The next time you encounter a product that promises to reverse time, to restore youth, to make you look 10 years younger overnight, you might pause and ask, what is really in the jar? And who benefits from my fear of aging? These questions do not require you to reject skincare or to judge anyone who chooses to use anti-aging products. They simply invite you to see the purchase for what it is, a choice within a system that has been carefully designed to make the choice feel like a necessity. Understanding the history of that system is the first step toward reclaiming the power it has borrowed from you. If you have found this exploration as fascinating and sobering as I did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you know. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next journey into the strange corners of history. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I love hearing from this community of curious minds, scattered across time zones, all drifting off to stories of the past. Now close your eyes, let the weight of the day slip away, and sink into the quiet darkness. Your own skin, whatever its lines and stories, is a living record of a life lived, not a problem to be solved. Sleep well, knowing that the most luminous glow has never come from a jar. Sweet dreams.